For over 30 years, I've collected interesting pieces of wood. They may be too useless to use and too beautiful to throw out, but these are a couple examples of things that you can make. Today we're going to make this. I have a 2-inch thick slab of sycamore. It has all kinds of wonderful pattern throughout. It was laying in a ditch when I found it, and I hauled it home and then cut it up with a chainsaw to make this slab. And so I'm first of all just kind of marking what I think will become an interesting and inviting shape. Each piece of wood like this is unique. Each piece requires special thought and thinking about what it will become. I used a chainsaw to cut the slab of wood to shape, leaving saw marks and random edges. I'm going to make a series of chainsaw cuts out of this area just to create a little seating spot. These cuts here could have been made with a skill saw, with a hand saw, with a jigsaw, or band saw, any number of other ways if you're uncomfortable with the chainsaw or if you don't have a chainsaw. And this cut in here can be done entirely using an angle grinder. It creates more dust that way, but it can still be done very successfully. Or the good old gouge. Watch your work carefully as you remove the coarse saw marks on the surface. Don't linger, allowing the disc to dig deep. Feels okay. Now I'm going to make and shape the legs. To attain a more rustic look, I could have used natural branches for legs, but for this small bench I decided to use 2-inch black walnut shaped and milled into octagons. Use a table saw to cut your leg stock to a uniform square shape. Okay, these are square, and now I'm ready to pass them through the planer to bring them to final dimension. To bevel the edges, I tilt the table saw blade to 45 degrees and cut each piece into an octagon shape. Cut the legs to a uniform length. I use a miter gauge and stop block on the table saw to make sure they come out the same. This is my little jig for holding things on the sawhorse that allow you to level your stock before you do your tenoning. So I just clamp this piece on the sawhorse Clamp it tightly at both ends. And then if I put my stock in that little V, I can use a level and I can find out how much it needs to be adjusted to level the stock. So I just raise that up and reclamp it. To cut the tenons on the legs, I use a Veritas tenon cutter. And so that should hold it in that position. Now the Lee Valley tenoner has a built-in level in it. So by leveling the stock and then holding the tenoner level, I'll be able to make a straighter tenon. It cuts a 1-inch diameter tenon on the ends of either round or square stock. The jig makes fitting the legs to the slab easy. I want to go far enough so that my tenon will pass through the stock. And so that should be my first tenon. These can actually be formed by hand. You can take the piece and you can put it in a lathe if you have a lathe, and you can turn your tenon using the lathe. The way the old pioneer would have done this would have been with a draw knife. Now it's time to drill the mortises. I use a 1/2-inch drill and a 1-inch auger bit to drill the holes for the mortises. Don't overwork the drill. You can make it go easier if you pull the bit out every now and then and remove the sawdust that builds up. If you've ever drilled all the way through a board, you know that drills break through the underside, tearing out chunks and leaving a mess. To avoid that, clamp a backing piece on the back of the board before you drill so that the drill cuts cleanly through. I used a piece of 3/4-inch pine held in place with a clamp. The angle you drill the mortises will determine the look of the piece, so use your visualization skills before you begin. Do a sketch and experiment with various angles. As I drill each mortise, I can insert a tenon leg in place and use it as a guide for helping me to judge the angle on the next. Now I'm going to... If you haven't made your tenons yet, you can use a dowel. When you drill the mortises, if you want your legs to flare out slightly, adjust the angle you hold the drill. If you want the legs to be straight, be careful that you hold the drill as vertical as you possibly can. Use a handsaw to cut a slot in the end of each tenon for fitting a wedge after assembly. It doesn't make any difference on the leg which way the wedge is oriented, but it does make a difference on the seat. If the wedge were going with the grain on the seat, it would risk splitting or cracking. Clamp the legs one at a time to the sawhorse and cut a kerf partway down the length of the tenon with a handsaw. To avoid splitting the leg and to maintain full strength, stop about 1/2 inch short of where the curved shape of the leg begins. For the wedges, the grain needs to go the same direction as the grain of the tenon. To make them, first plane or cut wood 1 inch thick to match the diameter of the tenon. Then clamp the blank vertically on the sawhorse and mark the shape and length of them clearly in pen. I use my combination square and my sliding T-bevel to mark the shapes of the wedges on the walnut stock. I also leave room in my marking to allow for the kerf of the saw. Cut along each line almost to the baseline. Then turn it on its side and cut the wedges loose. Sand the legs smooth before you put it together. Now it's time to glue. I spread Gorilla Glue on the inside of each hole. Gorilla Glue is made much more effective if it has a little bit of water as a catalyst. And I'll also take a rag and wet the legs slightly. And then I push the tenons into place. Now, I'm going to turn it over and position the legs. Before the glue has a chance to set, rotate the legs so that the wedge slots are aligned the way you want. Spread a bit of glue inside the wedge slots and then on each wedge. I use a business card to push a little bit of glue down inside the slot. Drive them into place with a hammer or wooden mallet. Guide the wedges carefully so that their edges align with the edges of the tenons. You can see here the Gorilla Glue kind of foams out as it cures, so it expands in the joint and gives a nice strong joint. After the glue is fully dried, use a handsaw to cut the tenons flush with the top. In this case, because I haven't sanded this yet, it would be all right for me to just go ahead and cut. But if I had already sanded that first, I want to have a little cushion to keep the saw from marring the surface as I saw. This will leave the tenons about 1/32 inch long, but a bit of spot sanding will make the tenons and wedges flush with the surface. Now it's time to shape the edges. I use a small draw knife, but a spoke shave or rasp or sanding block will also work well. The object is to soften the edges, making them less brittle, less sharp, and softer to the touch. You'll find that paying attention to the direction of the wood grain will help to avoid digging in or chipping out. To get the best results, pull the draw knife in the direction the grain exits the wood. Going against the grain will cause the tool to dig in and remove chunks rather than fine-cut shavings. I have a variety of choices in this, but I'm going to, I think, try to take it to a perfect finish, and I'm going to leave some texturing marks on the edges. Use a random orbit sander starting with 80 grit and then in sequence through 100, 120, 180, and 220. Adding texture to a piece can make it so interesting, particularly when you're trying to deal with a rough or random edge. Due to the irregularities of the slab, none of the legs can be the right length, so trimming is required. Place a bench on a flat and level surface. Slide a wedge under the legs until the bench is level and no longer rocks. Okay. Now take a 3/4 inch block and trace around each leg to mark off the amount needed to be cut. Tilt the bench on its side and rest the legs on a mat or piece of carpet. Use a handsaw to cut the legs to length. then sand the edges smooth. I apply steel gliders to the end of the legs to keep them from scratching the floor. They also visually separate the bench from the floor. It looks nicer. If this were a small table or a bench, it would be essentially done except for a few small details. Now with my rustic bench, I've shaped my seat, I've done some sanding on the top, and I'm ready for the next step, which will be to add a low back and arms. To do that, I'm going to make a laminated shape using thin walnut that I rip on the table saw. And this piece now is cut at about 1/8 of an inch thick, and I'm going to test and see if it will make the bend that I want. Okay, before I did this, I checked with a tape measure to kind of roughly gauge how long this would need to be. And now I've got my first strip cut, and you can see that this makes that bend. So I will cut a number of other pieces the same thickness and then laminate my back. Rip 1 1/4 inch thick walnut into uniform thin strips. Spread glue on the faces of the strips and clamp them to the form. I don't bother to spread the glue, I just apply it to each piece and layer one piece on top of the other. It only goes on one side. I'm careful to get an ample amount of glue. I don't want to starve the joint, so I get a little bit of excess. I don't mind if I have a little bit of glue oozing out as the piece gets clamped together. It just tells me that everything is well glued. The form is easy to make. I laid out the desired curve on a piece of plywood, then glued and screwed large blocks of wood along the line. Start with your clamps at the middle and work your way to the ends of the stock. This will help to avoid gaps between layers. Watch carefully for gaps, and if you see one, use extra clamping pressure to squeeze the wood tight. Once it's clamped, I'll let it dry for 2-3 hours. So I'm going to start just pulling clamps off, and we'll see how it fits. It may be stuck down to the board a little bit. If so, we'll just tap on it and make it come loose. Something like that. When the glue is dried, remove the back from the form and plane the edges down to 1 inch. I use 3/4 inch thick octagonal spindles to hold the back rail of the chair. Use the same technique to make the spindles as you use to make the legs. This is the octagon piece that I'll use cut up into short rungs to hold up the bench back. The tricky part is locating the correct position and angles for mortising the back into the seat. Use blocks of scrap wood and clamps to hold the back in the desired position above the seat. Then mark the locations for the supports. The octagonal posts will fit in here in different places, supporting the back. I'll drill down through the seat back with this long drill. So each time I drill through, I'll go all the way down into the seat, and each time that will mark where these two come together. Use a long 3/16 inch diameter drill bit to drill down through the seat back and into the seat. Drill 5/8 inch mortises in the underside of the seat back, and then matching mortises in the seat. Cut the spindles to length, then cut 3/4 inch long tenons on each end using a 5/8 inch tenon cutter. With the spindles dry fit in their mortises, saw the seat back ends to length.
So I'm going to follow the angle of this and set that on my sliding T-bevel. I'm sighting down to see what I'm doing. Now I'll mark it. This is not something that has to be extremely precise. Okay, now let's sit in it. Ah. It'll be a little more comfortable. Flat edge here. Okay. Now I'll put the glue in the seat. Yeah. I'm going to put a couple clamps on here just to make sure everything is held in position while the glue sets. This is my new invention. It's called Danish Rustic.
I finished the chair with Danish oil.
Spalted wood like this sycamore absorbs a lot of oil, and so I'll expect to do several applications. The great thing about it is that it will harden somewhat in the wood and give it some additional protection. I put a second coat on it, and may do a third because the sycamore is still looking kind of dry. The walnut will build up to a gloss more quickly. But when it comes to putting more oil on the sycamore, I'll just use a brush so I don't have to rub out the walnut as, again, I'll try to get them more uniform. I found that rustic materials are frequently made even more interesting by contrasting design elements. This coffee table is made with a wide natural edge spalted soft maple plank. The base is a trestle that uses an interesting joinery technique of overlapping parts log cabin style. The irregular natural edge top contrasts with the more contemporary finely finished trestle base. You can easily modify this design to fit the size of slab you may have available. I made this second table, which uses a branch and twig style construction more common in rustic work. In this case, the more finely finished top contrasts with the rougher bark covered legs. Either of these versions builds a visual interest through the use of contrast. On both table edges, I used a rotary chisel to make the straight sawn surfaces more rustic in appearance. The cut down the middle adds visual interest, but it was also done for a very practical reason. This board was too wide to go through my planer, so I cut it through the middle and then put it back together. It also allows a little space at the middle for expansion and contraction of wood. This stool provides a great way to put your feet up at the end of a long day. I base the size of this stool on one already in my home. You can upholster your stool with seagrass twine or shaker cloth tape. Making a footstool first can help you to master the skills required for more complicated projects like rustic chairs. While the best rustic work may look as though it just walked out of the woods, it's a mistake to think that you can just walk into the woods and make a chair. Natural wood is filled with moisture, each cell swollen like a fresh tomato. Each cell shrinks and hardens slightly as it dries, which means the whole stick will shrink over time. When you see splits and cracks in wood, it's the shrinkage from drying that is to blame. I often harvest materials for making furniture months in advance. Time to dry allows some of the shrinkage to take place before cutting the joints. In order for wood to dry, it has to be kept out of the rain in a place with some air circulation to carry away moisture. I have a shed where I hang sticks, limbs, and small trees to begin the drying process. For making a stool without bark, harvest your material in the spring or summer and peel the bark off immediately. This is a mulberry twig. I use a knife to dig under the bark and then pull, starting at the base and working my way up. You'll find that it gets easier as you go towards the top, as the upper bark is thinner and more flexible. Use pliers if you need to keep your hands from getting too tired. This would be hard work to do all day long, but wood for a small stool can be stripped in very little time. It works better in the springtime when you have a lot of sap flowing. This is the fall now, so it's the sap is actually starting to retreat. You can either use peeled branches or leave the bark on as shown in this variation. The choice largely depends on the time of year you harvest your stock. If you harvest your wood during the winter months, the bark will stay. I'm going to cut this up here so I have some of this, which is the interesting material. Cut your leg stock about 2 inches longer than the height of your finished stool. I use a handsaw. Wood shrinks as it dries. If a mortise is drilled in a piece of wood that is slightly damp and a tenon is cut on the end of a stick of drier wood, the mortise will shrink and tighten around the tenon, making a stronger joint. To make use of this principle, just before use, cut the parts for the bottom stretchers just over the required length and dry them in a drying box. I want to show you my very simple drying box. It's a cardboard box with a light bulb inside. A common trouble light will work. It's important to shield the hot bulb from the box and the wood to prevent a fire. Using it is simple. Fill the box with sticks for your stretchers, turn on the lamp, and close the box. You can also use the light bulb box to dry pieces of wood that are too long to fit. Cut holes in the side of the box just large enough for the end of the stock to fit through. A thermometer and humidity gauge inside will help you check the progress of your wood. Cut a window in the top of the box and cover it with clear tape so you can observe the reading even when the box is closed. But don't worry, exact readings are not required. Keep them in the heated box for about 24 hours and their moisture content will be reduced enough. Now I'll start making some decisions about how I want my legs to fit in relation to each other and how they'll look best in a stool. Okay, I'm going to make a story stick. This will be the top, and you have to remember some of this gets trimmed off of the top of the leg. And at 1 inch from that, there, I'll make another mark. Now, down here at this other end is my bottom. I want my other stretchers to go someplace in here. I don't want them down at the ground where it's hard to sweep around them or run the vacuum under it, but I don't want them up here at the top where they don't do much strengthening. So I'll put my other stretchers here at about the 8.5 inch mark and at about the 9.5 inch mark. Number 1, I'm also going to do this number 1, this number 2, and this number 2. Now the reason why I have these all set is that when one goes in from one side here, the other will go in from this side and they won't intersect in the middle of the leg, so they maintain their full strength. Use the story stick to mark the locations of the mortises on each leg. Drill 7/8 inch diameter holes for the upper stretchers to fit. I make the upper stretchers from ready-made 7/8 inch dowel stock rather than uneven sticks. This gives a smoother and more uniform structure for the seat. The upper stretchers are hidden by the seating material. Then drill the mortises for the lower stretchers using a 5/8 inch drill bit. Place a dowel in the upper mortise to help you gauge the angle as you drill. What happens next in making your footstool depends on the type of upholstery you plan to do on the top. If you're using seagrass twine like this, you can see it doesn't really matter very much how wide this is because this will adapt to a variety of widths. But if you're using the 1 inch wide shaker tape, then you see it lays on very specifically in 1 inch increments. I have to consider the width of the material in determining the width of my top stretchers. You can see that my mortise is 1 3/8 inches deep on each side, which means that I have to add 2 3/4 inches to whatever width of tape I want at the top. This is going to be for the seagrass footstool, so I'm going to make 2 pieces 13 3/4. Now we're ready to do our trial assembly. And side. Now it's time to form the lower stretchers. Measure the distance from leg to leg and add the depth of the tenons on both sides. 17 3/8 from one end to the other. This one needs to be 15. This one needs to be... I usually put one end of the tape in a mortise and measure to the other side, then add the additional mortise steps to come up with a finished length. Okay. Cut your stretchers to length. Use a V-block on the sawhorse and a clamp to hold the stretcher as you form the tenon. You can control the length of the tenon with a Veritas tenon cutter by cutting a dowel to go inside the hole, which will then stop the tenon from cutting any farther. Right there. So I'm going to trim that to length and then form my tenon on the other end. I can see if my first piece fits. You can adjust how things fit by turning a little bit like that. Okay, it will go with a little persuasion. Okay, let's see what I've done. Assemble the footstool without glue for a trial fit. Sometimes rotating the stretchers in place will help find the way they fit best, and sometimes reversing them end for end can help. After all, the joints were cut without absolute precision. After you do a trial assembly, you want to make sure you get everything laid out exactly the way you want it to go together. Otherwise, you get in the middle of things, you have glue all over, and it won't be anywhere near as much fun. So I'm going to put a little bit of Gorilla Glue in each hole. I'm going to use a dowel to spread it around and make sure that glue is on every surface on the inside. And if it looks like it doesn't have enough to get everything, I'll put just a little bit more. Remember, this glue expands as it dries, so you certainly don't want to get too much in there, but you want to make sure that surface gets covered evenly. Okay, so now I'll take this piece exactly as it came apart and slide it into place, and the same here. Okay, now I'm going to spread glue in the next one. It looks very awkward right now, but it will look better when it's all finished. Use band clamps to pull all the joints tight, and then let the stool sit until the glue has set. I must have made a terrible mistake. Just look at my footstool. It doesn't work very good. I'm going to have to do something to make it better. So the first thing I'll do is I'll measure the high corner, and it comes out at 17 3/4 of an inch. Now I'm going to go over here catty corner to the other side, and I'm going to clamp a piece of wood on here to bring this up to relatively the same height. Set up on the other corner. $17 3/4. So I want to decide how much I want to cut off those 4 legs. I can use something like a 2x4,
rather than mark it with a pencil, which would be very hard to do, I'm going to mark it with my saw. Now I'm going to lay it over on its side and trim it off. The next thing I want to do is make an angle cut across here at each corner, which will just soften having corners on it, so that when you put your feet up on it, there won't be these tall things that you're going to bump into. Now I'll sand the tops and bottoms of the legs and add my 3-point furniture glides. Cut that off. Now I'm ready to do the seat in seagrass twine. Sometimes when you're making rustic furniture, things don't come out completely square, but in order to do a good job on applying a seagrass seat, you want to be able to square everything first. So in this case, you see that measures about 14.5 to 3/4. This measures about 14. So I have a little bit of space to make up right there, and I'm going to show you how to do it. Now this same technique is used when you're forming a seat on a chair, because you'll notice that it's wider at the front and narrower at the back. So you have to fill in on both sides before you come to a rectangular pattern. I only have to do that until I've filled in this amount of space. So now I'll be able to work my way starting from this other side. The first thing I need is a piece that's just long enough to feel comfortable in looping it around. So I'm just going to cut off a piece and I'm going to tack it on the side. Okay, it always goes over, under, and you can see why you'll have to cut these pieces a little bit shorter than trying to use the full length. Over, and then it goes over here to the other corner, and it goes over, over, and back, over. You see it just keeps going over, and then to the next corner. And as long as you keep remembering to go over, you see, it works out. So now I come up to the next corner. And you'll want to keep a fairly even tension on it all the time. And make sure that things pull tight into the corners as you go. Now this is good because when I come to an end like that, I want it to be buried underneath and not on the top side. So I'm going to snip this little bit off and unravel it a little bit. And I'll take that piece the other end where I cut off,
and do the same to it. So you can see I'm unraveling both of them just about an inch or so, and then I push them together. So I hold them tight together, and I take a piece of copper wire about 6 inches long and just start wrapping it real tight. Now you can also just tie these in a knot, but a knot becomes a little bit harder to hide than this little bump. So I wrap it tight until I can come back to the other end of the wire, and I'll take both of those ends and twist them tight. So that should give me a strong splice. So now I do the same thing again. I want to get a nice long piece to work with. I want to make sure that I didn't lose any of my tension here, so I'm going to pull it tight again. And I go over. And as long as I don't forget to keep going over, I'll be able to keep my pattern.
Try to use a uniform amount of pull as you work. Inconsistency can show up as loose spots in the finished stool. If you make a mistake but don't find it until later, don't be afraid to unwind and backtrack. When you fill the space on the two sides and still have some space to fill in the middle, now it's a matter of coming back and forth through here in a figure 8 pattern. And this is what finishes it out. Okay, I'm going to bring it around under here and tack it in place. I usually take a little bit of messing around with to get things evened out. My next step will be to put an oil finish on it. The Danish oil will actually protect and seal this material. I always put a little extra oil on the end grain because it soaks up the oil more quickly. I'll let things sit for about 20 minutes and come out with a dry cloth and just go over everything carefully. I want to wipe them off before the oil finish starts to get tacky, and the reason is if it gets tacky it'll start pulling fibers off the cloth. And so I'm just going to go very carefully. I'm working as gently as I can to keep from pulling any bark off as I go. Now this oil finish should be completely dry in 24 hours. If you're planning to use shaker tape on your stool, design the length of the stretchers in even inches. This allows for a set number of 1-inch wide wraps of tape.
You'll find it a lot easier if you're a beginner to work with straight stock. It's much easier to build a footstool if you started with limbs that are fairly straight than if you're trying to work with limbs that have a lot of curvature to them. You can save the more curved limbs and things until you've had more practice and understand a little bit better how to make the tool cut the tenons you need. That everything's tight together, okay? This one I'm going to use shaker tape, and you don't want to get the oil on the shaker tape. So I'm going to oil this one before the seat goes in. If you try to apply Danish oil with a rag, you're likely to move around little pieces of bark that you might want to keep. Use carpet tacks to attach one end of the tape to the front stretcher. Then wrap the tape over to hide the tack. Next, wrap the tape around the side stretchers until they're covered. When you get the correct number of wraps in place, tightly spaced, pull the end tight and tack it to the other side stretcher. This part of the weaving is called the warp. Okay, so now I'll put my padding in place. Slide a layer of padding between the wraps of tape. You can use 1-inch thick foam or fiber padding. Cut it to fit between the stretchers, less about 1/2 inch clearance each dimension. Use another color of shaker tape for contrast. Tack one end to the inside of the front rail, then wrap the tape over to hide the tack as you begin weaving through the warp. This part of the weaving is called the weft. I'm going to go. Weave the pattern under and over the warp tape, pulling with uniform tension and making sure that it goes across straight. It's important to weave on both the top and bottom sides for the best results. This will help to keep the top aligned and make for a neater job. I'll keep pushing it down tight as I go and observe that it forms a straight line across there. Otherwise I'll run out of space in the middle. And then you'll notice that when we get to the underside, you can see how it has to compensate to go to the next row by moving over one. If you aren't careful, the weft will bow out in the middle as it passes from side to side. Take time to pull it straight as you go. I use 3 or 4 yard lengths of shaker tape at a time. If you use longer pieces, it can get tangled and slow you down. I'm getting to where I want to be able to hide the seam that goes to my next piece. So I'm going to try to do it right under here. Because the shaker tape is cut into 3 or 4 yard long pieces to make the weaving easier, when you get to the end of a piece, add a new one by sewing the two together. Plan the joint so it will be hidden by the warp underneath.
and sew the two layers together to make the seam.
And now I go back to the fun part. And see, you can't even see that I did it, right? Here we are on the last row, and it gets kind of hard. You just kind of have to work your way through because there's not a lot of space anymore for these pieces to stretch or flex out of the way. But it also means I'm almost done. Now again, I want to pull everything down to try to make my line across here look straight. Okay, now I come to the bottom and I'm ready to finish up. So now I'm going to make this end come to a stopping point, and the tension of the chair, tension of all the weaving, will hold everything in place. So I've got to just work my way underneath there. The tension of these pieces will be more than enough to hold everything in place. So when I get down here to the end and ready to go under the last one, okay, I'll snip it off right there and tuck this end under. There we go. One of the things you'll find quickly in doing rustic work is that when you use fresh green material, there is a likelihood of splitting. The splitting would be caused by the contraction of the wood as it loses moisture. But you can see it's still very strong and will certainly support